$10,000. That was the number staring back at me from the thickest piece of paper I'd ever held in my life. It felt less like a letter and more like a tombstone, heavy and cold in my hand. And all of it, every last dollar of that ridiculous 5-figure sum, was for a fence. My fence. On my land. Now I'll be the first to admit it wasn't a pretty fence. It wasn't designed to be. It was a proper farm-grade post and wire setup, reinforced with mesh, the kind of fence that does its job, which was quite simply to keep my 2 curious steers from turning my new neighbor's prize-winning pansies into a light afternoon salad. It had happened once. I'm a man who believes once is enough. So I built the fence. It was sturdy, it was safe, and it was 100% legal by every county code in the book. I'd pulled the permits myself, but you see it wasn't tranquil. A short, dry chuckle. That was the word she used. The woman who had signed the letter, the self-appointed queen of our little corner of the world, the president of our homeowners association, Eleanor Vance. According to Eleanor, the glint of sun off the new wire disrupted something she called visual tranquility. Apparently, my attempt to be a responsible rancher had shattered the pastoral harmony of the neighborhood. This neighborhood, mind you, where my land had been a working farm for 100 years before her faux Tuscan villa and its ridiculous collection of garden gnomes ever broke ground. I stood there by my mailbox, the offending letter in hand, and just looked out over my property. This land was my life's work. It was my father's before me. We weren't hobbyists, we were ranchers, and this letter felt like an insult to all of it. Just then, a friendly voice cut through the quiet anger. "Morning, Liam. Looks like you got one of Eleanor's love letters." It was my neighbor from across the greenbelt, Marcus Thorne. He was a decent enough guy, always quick with a wave and a smile. He leaned on his shovel, looking over at my new fence. "Heard she was kicking up a fuss about it," he said, shaking his head with a sympathetic grin. "Looks like a solid fence to me. Don't you let her push you around. Some people just have too much time on their hands." I appreciated the sentiment. It made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. "I plan on it, Marcus," I said. "Thanks. I thought it was a simple misunderstanding, a disagreement between neighbors that a reasonable conversation could solve. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the number listed on the notice, hoping to speak to someone on the board. The call went straight to a pre-recorded message from Eleanor herself, detailing her hours of availability and her preferred method of contact, email only. So I emailed. I was polite but firm. I explained the fence was well within my property lines. I explained it met all county codes and was erected for the safety of my livestock and the protection of my neighbor's property. I even included the permit number. I laid out the facts clear as day. 3 days later, I got a reply. It was 1 sentence long. "Your fence does not align with our community's aesthetic values. Please remove it by Friday or face penalties." I ignored it. Friday came and went. The fence stood. And then came the certified letter with the fine. The $10,000 fine. My hands were shaking. Not with fear, but with a cold, slow-burning rage. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. There was only one thing left to do. I requested a hearing at the next HOA board meeting. The community room was just as sterile and joyless as I'd imagined. A long plastic table sat under harsh fluorescent lights, and at the head of it, like a monarch on a plastic throne, sat Eleanor Vance. She held a printed agenda and a small silver bell she'd ring any time a voice was raised. I presented my case calmly. I showed them the legal documents, the county livestock safety regulations. I even brought aerial maps from the county surveyor showing that not a single inch of the fence encroached on common property. I laid out a mountain of facts, of logic, of law. Eleanor smiled. It was a thin, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She nodded, listened, and then, after I was finished, she looked at the board and said, "It's not about legality, Liam. It's about community standards. I watched as the vote was called. I saw Marcus in the corner. He made a little show of looking conflicted, of wringing his hands before his own hand went up with the rest of them. The only one who hesitated, the only no vote, was a younger man named David Chen. He wouldn't meet my eyes on the way out. The vote was 4-1. The fine was upheld. I walked out of that room, the fluorescent lights buzzing behind me, and the world felt different. The air was sharp in my lungs. My vision was narrowed down to a single point. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the sheer, arrogant injustice of it all. It was about a woman who had crowned herself queen, and a board that was too cowardly to stand up to her. They thought they could bury me in fines and regulations. They thought I would just roll over. That night, I sat on my back porch with a glass of bourbon in my hand, the ice clinking softly in the silence. I stared out over my pasture where my 2 steers were settling down for the night. The fence was just a dark line in the moonlight. A simple, functional thing. And that's when it hit me. My mistake was arguing about the fence at all. The fence was never the issue. The real issue was what the fence was for. Eleanor and her board were offended by the simple, rural functionality of it. A thought, cold and clear as the night air, cut through the anger. They wanted to fine me for the fence that contains the animal. Fine. They're about to meet the animal. The bourbon sat untouched on the railing next to me. The anger that had been a hot, boiling thing in my chest had cooled into something else entirely, something cold, hard, and perfectly clear. An idea. It wasn't a half-baked scheme born from frustration. It was a strategy. Eleanor Vance and her board wanted to play a game of rules and regulations. Fine. I'd play too, but I'd be playing from a different rule book, one that was older and more fundamental than their flimsy HOA charter, the rule book of the land itself. The next morning, before the sun had even kissed the horizon, I was on the phone with my cousin Cody in Montana. Cody's the kind of man who's more comfortable with a herd of elk than a room full of people. He runs a bison preserve up there, and his laugh is as big as the sky he lives under. I told him the whole story. The fence, the fine, the visual tranquility. His laughter boomed through the phone so hard I could hear him choking on his morning coffee. When he finally caught his breath, he just said, "So, let me get this straight, little cousin. They're fining you for the cage, but they haven't even met the tiger." "Something like that, Cody," I said. "You want some buffalo?" he asked, the grin evident in his voice. "I'll send you the 3 tamest ones we got. They're as gentle as big, hairy, 2,000-pound house cats." That was the only green light I needed, but I knew this couldn't be a reckless move. It had to be airtight. It had to be legal. More legal than Eleanor's ridiculous fine. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't just work my ranch. I became a scholar of agricultural law. I spent my nights poring over county zoning ordinances, state livestock containment protocols, and federal guidelines for housing indigenous species. I read about fencing requirements, signage mandates, and emergency procedures until the words blurred together. I made calls. I visited the local agricultural extension office, a place the HOA probably didn't even know existed. I laid out my plan to a man named George who had worked there for 40 years. He looked over my property schematics, my fence specifications, and my proposed care plan. He nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Son," he said, stamping my application with a satisfying thud. "As long as they're on your private land, properly contained and cared for, there's not a damn thing your HOA can do about it." I reinforced my gates with steel. I installed solar-powered alarms on the perimeter fence. I ordered 3 tons of the highest grade feed. I didn't tell a soul what was coming. I wanted the surprise to land with the force of a prairie thunderstorm. And then, one brisk morning, as dew still clung to the grass, it arrived. A long, silver trailer, pulled by a semi that rumbled so low it vibrated in my bones, backed carefully onto my property. Cody's man, a quiet ranch hand named Hank, lowered the ramp. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a massive dark head emerged from the trailer. It was Dakota, the big male. His hooves hit the ground, not with a clatter, but with a deep, resonant thud. He was immense, a mountain of dark fur and muscle, with a beard that hung to his knees and eyes that seemed to hold the memory of 1,000,000 years. Behind him came two females, slightly smaller but no less majestic, their movements deceptively graceful. My dog, a brave Australian shepherd who wasn't afraid of a charging steer, took one look, tucked his tail, and ran for the barn without a sound. I just stood there, speechless. They were magnificent. They were power. They were history, alive and breathing on my land. By noon, the bison were grazing peacefully, adjusting to their new home. I'd set up a feeding station, installed watering troughs, and posted clear, professionally made signs along the fence line, warning folks not to approach. The silence of it all was beautiful. It didn't last long. By evening, a car crunched to a halt on the gravel road. It was Eleanor. She wasn't alone. She was flanked by two other board members, her own little royal guard. She wore oversized sunglasses and a tracksuit that probably cost more than my first truck. She stared at the bison as if they were alien creatures that had just crash-landed. Dakota lifted his massive head, chewed his cud with a profound indifference, and looked right through her. "What?" she snapped, her voice tight with a rage she was struggling to contain. "Is the meaning of this?" I leaned against my fence post, channeling my inner Cody, and gave her my calmest, most neighborly smile. "Livestock, Eleanor. My new herd. Perfectly legal." Her jaw worked, chewing on her anger. "I'm calling animal control." "Already did," I said cheerfully. "They were notified last week. They have copies of all my permits. Feel free to call them yourself, though. They'll confirm everything I've just said." She did. I watched as she furiously jabbed at her phone, her voice shrill with panic. I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but I could see the color draining from her face. She snapped her phone shut, threw one more look of pure venom at me and the bison, and stormed back to her car, screaming about disease, danger, and property values. I went back to my porch, poured myself that bourbon I'd left the other night, and watched my new friends wander toward the back fence, the one that bordered the HOA's precious park. It was a good day. The next afternoon, Marcus Thorne came by, a wide grin on his face. "Liam, you're a legend!" he boomed, slapping me on the back. "I saw Eleanor's face this morning. I thought she was going to have an aneurysm. This is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." His enthusiasm was infectious, and in my small victory, I felt a kinship with him. He seemed to be the only one who truly understood the absurdity of it all. "Just making sure I'm following all the rules," I said with a wink. "You showed me the security upgrades you put in?" he asked, genuinely curious. Feeling proud of my work, I walked him around. I showed him the reinforced steel gates, the double lock system, and the new solar-powered alarms. "If anyone so much as touches that fence, it sends an alert straight to my phone," I explained. "Smart," he said, nodding in appreciation. "Very smart. You can't be too careful with her. Let me know if you need anything. Seriously, I'll keep an eye out for you." I thanked him, feeling a little less like I was on an island. It was a mistake I would come to regret more than any other. For a few weeks, a tense peace settled over the neighborhood. The HOA kept sending me threatening letters, which I started using as kindling, but I could feel something brewing. Eleanor wasn't the type to accept defeat. The next envelope that arrived wasn't from the HOA. It was from their lawyers. It was thicker, heavier. The language inside was no longer about aesthetics. It was about law, an old obscure law Eleanor's legal eagles had dug up from the dust of history, a municipal bylaw from 1892, written when this town was nothing but a trading post, that prohibited the housing of non-domesticated bovines of a wild or untamed nature within town limits. My heart sank. The ground, which had felt so solid beneath my feet, suddenly felt like quicksand. My permits were from the county and the state. They were modern, relevant, but this was a ghost from the past, a legal loophole I had never imagined. My entire strategy, my beautiful, airtight plan, was suddenly in jeopardy. Eleanor had outmaneuvered me. My lawyer confirmed my fears. "It's archaic, Liam," he said over the phone, his voice grim. "It's probably unenforceable, but to prove that, we'd have to go to court, and that will take months and cost you a fortune. She's got you in a bind." I felt that old anger returning, but this time it was laced with a cold dread. I wasn't going to lose this fight because I was wrong. I was going to lose because she had more money and more lawyers than I did. But I wasn't done yet. If she was going to dig into the past, then so was I. That weekend, I drove down to the county seat, to the records office in the basement of the old courthouse. It was a place that smelled of old paper, dust, and time itself. I spent 2 days surrounded by massive leather-bound ledgers and crumbling maps, my hands covered in grime. I was looking for anything that could help me, old agricultural exemptions, zoning variances, anything. On the afternoon of the second day, just as I was about to give up, I found it. Tucked away in a 1920s planning ledger was a specific agricultural covenant attached to my parcel of land. It was a grandfather clause, explicitly granting the property owner the right to conduct all manner of agricultural and livestock operations customary to the region, exempting it from future municipal restrictions. The town had absorbed the farmland, but the rights of the farm had been preserved. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost knocked me over. I had it. I had the silver bullet, but my curiosity was piqued. I started looking at the older ledgers, the ones from the late 1800s. I wanted to see who owned my land back then. I traced the property line back through the decades, the names changing with each entry. And then, in a ledger from 1888, I saw it, a name that made the hair on my arms stand up. Proprietor, Jedediah Vance. I kept digging. I pulled public records, old newspaper clippings on microfiche. The story pieced itself together. Jedediah Vance had been one of the town's founders. He owned a massive tract of land, including the very ground my house now stood on. But he'd made a series of bad investments, and during the financial panic of 1893, he lost everything. The farm was sold at auction. The Vance family, once prominent, had fallen into disgrace and obscurity. Eleanor wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was Jedediah's great-granddaughter. I leaned back in the rickety wooden chair, the dusty silence of the archive pressing in on me. It all clicked into place. Her obsession with the land, her visceral, personal hatred of my presence there, her use of an old forgotten law from her family's era. This was never about offense. It was never about visual tranquility. It was about a ghost. It was about a woman trying to reclaim the lost glory of her family, trying to exert control over the one piece of land that symbolized their downfall. My ranch. I walked out of that courthouse basement and into the late afternoon sun, the world looking different yet again. The game had changed. I wasn't just fighting a petty tyrant anymore. I was fighting a ghost, a century-old grudge. And I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this fight was far from over. Eleanor Vance had just made it personal, and so had I. I walked out of that courthouse with more than just a legal defense. I had the truth. The fight was no longer about a fence or a fine. It was about a 100-year-old ghost, a deep and bitter grudge that Eleanor Vance had carried her entire life. She hadn't just made it personal, she had revealed the very reason for the war, and now I had my ammunition. Through my lawyer, I sent a formal letter to the HOA board, including a notarized copy of the agricultural covenant from 1922. The letter was simple. It stated that my property was legally exempt from the 1892 bylaw, that my livestock was fully permitted, and that we now considered the matter closed. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that a fact, a hard, undeniable legal fact, would be the end of it. Eleanor's response came 2 days later, not in a letter, but on a flyer taped to every lamppost in the neighborhood. Emergency outdoor town hall, it screamed in a dramatic, bold font. Topic: the imminent danger of uncontained wildlife and the enforcement of community bylaws. And the location she had chosen: the community park gazebo, a flimsy wooden structure not 50 yards from my western fence line. It was a deliberate provocation, a spectacle. She wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to humiliate me in a public forum, right on my own doorstep. The flyer ended with a final, chilling line: a community vote will be taken. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. The weather forecast, fittingly enough, called for a severe thunderstorm to roll in around the same time. The morning of the meeting, just as I was gathering my documents, Marcus Thorne's truck pulled into my driveway. He got out, his face a mask of neighborly concern. "Just wanted to wish you luck, Liam," he said, his voice low. "This whole thing is a circus. She's really gone off the deep end this time." "That she has, Marcus," I said, my mind elsewhere, rehearsing my arguments. "Listen," he said, looking up at the darkening sky. "I know you're headed over there to prepare. Why don't I do a quick check on that west gate for you? Make sure everything's secure before this storm hits. Wouldn't want any trouble." In that moment, distracted and grateful for the offer of help, I saw nothing but a friendly gesture. "Thanks, Marcus. I'd appreciate that." He gave me a firm nod and headed off toward the pasture. "You got it, neighbor," he called over his shoulder. "We're in this together." An hour later, I stood before the crowd at the gazebo. At least 50 people were there, sitting in folding chairs, a mix of retirees, curious neighbors, and a handful of Eleanor's loyalists in the front row. Eleanor herself stood at a podium, looking regal and severe. The air was thick and heavy, charged with humidity and tension. The first distant rumble of thunder echoed from the west. She gave a dramatic speech, full of fear-mongering about disease and stampedes. Then she turned the floor over to me, a smug look on her face, as if she were offering a condemned man his last words. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I simply stood up, holding the file of historical documents, and began to tell them the truth. I told them about the 1922 Agricultural Covenant. I explained what a grandfather clause was. I saw a ripple of confusion and curiosity move through the crowd. This wasn't the story Eleanor had told them. David Chen, sitting on the edge of the crowd, gave me a slight, encouraging nod. I was winning. The facts were on my side, and people were starting to see it. I was just about to present the final, damning evidence, the proof of Eleanor's personal, historical vendetta, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A silent vibration, a single notification on the screen. Security alert, Westgate fence. My blood ran cold. I discreetly unlocked the phone under the cover of my notes. The live camera feed popped up. The image was grainy in the growing gloom, but the scene was clear. The bison were not grazing peacefully. They were agitated, bunched together, moving nervously as the wind began to whip through the pasture. Dakota, the big male, was pushing his massive head against the gate, testing it. The storm was spooking them. My eyes shot up from the phone, scanning the crowd. I was looking for I didn't even know what. My gaze landed on Marcus Thorne. He was standing at the back, arms crossed, and in a brief, brilliant flash of lightning that lit up the entire park, I saw it. It wasn't a look of concern. It wasn't the look of a worried neighbor. It was a small, tight, smug smile, a look of anticipation. In that single, horrifying instant, everything clicked into place. His offer to check the gate, his feigned support, the security alert. It was him. Crack! The sound wasn't thunder. It was sharp, loud, and sickeningly close. The sound of wood splintering under immense pressure. Every head turned toward my fence. The choice I had to make wasn't a choice at all. The papers in my hand, my legal victory, they meant nothing. The wind tore the documents from my grasp. They scattered like panicked birds into the storm. I didn't care. "Get back!" I roared, my voice raw. "The fence! Everyone get back!" I ran. I vaulted the small decorative railing of the gazebo and sprinted across the damp grass. the rain starting to fall in thick, heavy drops. The scene in front of me was a nightmare. The main latch on the heavy wooden gate had been tampered with. It was broken, hanging uselessly. The gate itself was bowing outward, held only by a secondary slide bolt that was groaning under the strain. Through the growing gap, I could see the wild, frightened eye of Dakota as he pushed with all his 2,000-pound might. Behind me, the town hall had devolved into chaos. People were screaming, scrambling over chairs, running away from the very danger Eleanor had salivated over. I reached the gate and threw my entire body against it, my shoulder screaming in protest. The force on the other side was immense, a living, breathing tidal wave of panic and power. My boots slid on the wet grass. I was losing ground. The slide bolt shrieked, metal scraping against metal. It was going to give. Then through the roar of the wind and the rain, I heard another sound. Shouting, but it wasn't screaming. It was my name. Liam! Hang on! I risked a glance over my shoulder. Two figures were running through the downpour, not away from the danger, but straight towards it. It was David Chen, his suit jacket soaked and flying behind him, and another man I recognized from the feed store. They slammed into the gate next to me, adding their weight. "Push!" David yelled, his face grim with effort. "Push!" Another man joined us, and then another. It was a small, desperate handful of us, a strange alliance of neighbors, our shoulders pressed together, fighting to hold back the chaos. We were soaked, straining, our feet digging trenches in the mud. On the other side, the bison pushed and snorted, their panic a tangible force. We were holding, just barely. I looked past the straining faces of the men beside me, back toward the gazebo. Eleanor Vance was huddled under its roof, screaming into her phone. Marcus Thorne was gone. He had vanished into the storm, leaving his destruction behind. In that moment, soaked to the bone and fighting for every inch, I realized the truth. Eleanor and Marcus, they knew how to break things. They knew how to create fear and chaos, but they had no idea how to build a fence or how to hold one together. The rain began to soften, turning from a blinding sheet into a steady, cleansing drizzle. The thunder rolled away into the distance, a retreating drumbeat. On our side of the fence, the bison, their panic subsiding with the storm, had backed away, their dark shapes moving like shadows in the fading light. The immediate danger was over. I looked at the men beside me. David Chen, his hair plastered to his forehead. Two other neighbors I barely knew, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion. We shared a look, no words needed. It was the look of men who had stood together when things got real. A bond forged in the mud, holding back a storm. Then the flashing lights arrived, not with blaring sirens, but with a quiet, official presence. Two sheriff's cruisers pulled into the park. An officer, a man I recognized as Sheriff Brody, a no-nonsense veteran, stepped out and took in the whole chaotic scene with a calm, practiced eye. He saw the broken, mud-rutted ground. He saw the splintered gate being held together by a small, drenched group of citizens. And he saw Eleanor, who was now marching toward him, already pointing a trembling finger at me. "Arrest that man!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "He's a menace! His beasts almost killed us all! I demand you do something!" Sheriff Brody listened patiently, his gaze sweeping over me, then to the bison, then back to the gate. He walked over, his boots squelching in the mud. He didn't look at me with accusation. He just asked, his voice low and even, "Son, you want to tell me what happened here?" I told him. The whole story, right there in the rain. And as I spoke, David Chen and the others nodded in agreement. The aftermath was a blur of logistics. A deputy helped us rig a temporary chain to secure the gate. Statements were taken. But through it all, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I knew what I had to do next. Back at my house, drenched and bone-tired, I didn't reach for the bourbon. I put on a pot of coffee, the dark, bitter smell filling my kitchen. I sat down at my small desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the security footage from earlier that afternoon. There was no satisfaction in what I was doing, just a grim necessity. I rewound the timeline to an hour before the meeting. The footage was clear. I watched as Marcus Thorne, my friendly neighbor, walked up to the west gate. He looked left, then right, thinking he was alone. He fumbled with the heavy slide bolt for a moment, then gave the main latch a hard, deliberate yank. I saw the wood around the mechanism splinter slightly. It wasn't enough to break it open, but it was enough to weaken it, to ensure it would fail under pressure. He gave his handiwork a brief, satisfied look before turning and walking away, whistling softly. I saved the file to a USB drive. The smoking gun. The next morning I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't call the HOA. I drove into town and walked into the sheriff's office, the USB drive and a file folder in my hand. Sheriff Brody saw me and waved me into his small, cluttered office. "Liam," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I'm still trying to sort out that mess from yesterday." "I think I can help you with that, Sheriff," I said, my voice steady. I placed the folder on his desk. I laid it all out for him, piece by piece. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just presented the facts. First, the history of the fines and the harassment from Eleanor. Second, the copies of the county records proving her personal, historical vendetta against my land. And finally, I placed the small USB drive on top of the pile. "And this, Sheriff," I said, "is a video of Marcus Thorne sabotaging my gate less than an hour before the storm hit. He didn't just endanger my property, he endangered every person Eleanor gathered in that park." Sheriff Brody watched me, his expression unreadable. He took the USB drive, plugged it into his computer, and watched the video in silence. His face, which had been patient and professional, hardened into a mask of grim resolve. He watched it once, then a second time. When it was finished, he looked up at me, and all he said was, "Thank you for bringing this to me, Liam. You stay put. We'll handle it from here." I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it later. The first cruiser went to Marcus Thorne's house. He reportedly answered the door with a confident smile, a smile that vanished the moment he saw the sheriff on his porch. There was no smugness left as they put him in cuffs. The second cruiser went to the faux Tuscan villa. Eleanor, I was told, put up a fight. She sputtered about her rights, about her lawyers, about the influence of the Vance family name, a name that now meant nothing. The sight of their HOA president, the queen of visual tranquility, being led to a patrol car in handcuffs was the talk of the town for weeks. The war was over. The story spread like a wildfire, fueled by David Chen and the other witnesses who told everyone what they had seen. Not a reckless rancher, but a man who had stood his ground, and a group of neighbors who had stood with him. The narrative that Eleanor had worked so hard to build had shattered in an instant. The queen had been dethroned, and her co-conspirator was facing felony charges. Looking out at my pasture that evening, at the calm, majestic forms of the bison grazing peacefully under the sunset, I felt a quiet sense of finality. But it wasn't a celebration. Winning the war, I was beginning to understand, was one thing. Building the peace. That was a different job entirely. Winning the war, I was beginning to understand, was one thing. Building the peace. That was a different job entirely. The silence left by Eleanor's and Marcus's departure was deafening at first. The neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The HOA held an emergency meeting, but this time the atmosphere was funereal. There was no silver bell, no plastic throne. David Chen, looking exhausted but determined, stood before the handful of residents who'd shown up. He didn't make a speech. He simply called for 2 formal votes. The first to permanently remove Eleanor Vance from all duties and privileges. The second for Marcus Thorne. Both passed unanimously, in a heavy silence. The reckoning, however, was just beginning. My lawyer sent the new board a letter. It wasn't a threat, it was a bill. A detailed accounting of my legal fees, the cost of repairing the sabotaged gate, and a carefully calculated figure for damages related to harassment and abuse of authority. It wasn't a $10,000 fine. It was more. A week later, David Chen came to my door. He didn't come as the HOA president. He came as a neighbor. He held a check from the HOA's account in his hand. "Liam," he said, his voice earnest, "there's no excuse for what happened. We let Eleanor run wild, and we were too intimidated to stop her. We failed as a board and as your neighbors. On behalf of the HOA, I am deeply, truly sorry." He handed me the check. It was for the full amount. "We don't want to just pay a bill," he continued. "We want to fix what's broken. I'm asking for your help. We need to rewrite the bylaws to put in protection so this can never happen again. A right to farm clause for properties like yours." I looked at this man, who had been the lone voice of dissent in that first meeting, and I saw something that had been missing for a long time: genuine accountability. I took the check, and then I shook his hand. "I'd be happy to help, David," I said. And I meant it. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened. The Bison, once the terrifying symbols of my defiance, became local celebrities. The fear-mongering of Eleanor Vance was replaced by a genuine curiosity and affection. Families would park along the road on a Sunday afternoon just to watch Dakota and his herd graze. A local elementary school asked if they could arrange a field trip. That's when another idea began to take root. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was an opportunity. I partnered with the local agricultural extension office to develop an educational program. I started offering small, guided tours on weekends, explaining the history of bison on the prairie and their role in a healthy ecosystem. The tours sold out. What started as a way to prove a point had grown into a small, thriving business. I partnered with a fellow rancher 2 counties over, not my bison, they were part of the family, to produce and sell ethically harvested bison meat and jerky at the local farmers market. People loved it. The story behind it, the tale of the Bison Rebellion, as some folks called it, gave it a life of its own. The fence, the object that started it all, became a landmark. One morning, I came out to find someone had spray-painted 2 words in neat black letters on one of the main crossbeams, Prairie Justice. My first instinct was to scrub it off, but then I looked at it, and I smiled. I went to my workshop, got my wood carving tools, and spent the rest of the afternoon carefully carving those words right into the wood, making them a permanent part of the structure. It was no longer just a fence. It was a monument. People would stop and take pictures with it. Eleanor's house sold quietly a few months later. The rumor was she'd moved to a stricter gated community across the state, one with a more professional HOA. I wished her well, from a distance. Marcus Thorne took a plea bargain and moved away after his probation, his reputation in tatters. Their chapter was closed. Tonight I'm sitting on my back porch again, a familiar glass of bourbon in my hand. But the feeling is different. The anger is gone. The frustration is a distant memory. The silence isn't heavy anymore. It's filled with the gentle sounds of the evening. The chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional deep, rumbling snort from the pasture. Dakota is standing near the fence, that famous fence, his massive silhouette outlined against a sky awash with the colors of a prairie sunset. He looks peaceful. He looks like he belongs. I finally understand. Eleanor wanted to reclaim a piece of her family's past. Marcus wanted to steal a piece of my future. But in the end, all their scheming and all their anger did was remind everyone else what a community is really for. It isn't about enforcing rules for the sake of power. It's about neighbors helping neighbors hold a gate together in a storm. I raised my glass to the dark shape of the bison, to the fence, to the hard-won peace. He should have just let me keep my fence. But if she had, I never would have found my herd.